Okay, just quickly, if you've worked with us at all, or if you've been to any of our webinars, you know we're big fans of DBAtools. This is a community PowerShell module, over 600 commands. This, if you're not using DBAtools because either you just haven't or you don't know PowerShell, you know this is the reason for a DBA to learn PowerShell. There are so many things that it does that make life so much easier, right? If you know me at all, I'm all about automation. Sometimes I think it's just because I'm lazy. If I have to do something tedious 2 or 3 times, I want to automate it, right? And that's what DBAtools is about. So just kind of a couple of quick reviews, you know, on how to find the commands, the documentation. But when we did that other webinar, you know, we showed how we can use DBAtools to migrate all of these things, or essentially, you know, copy them from one server to another. And it's a huge time saver, especially, you know, with things like logins, right? It copies it using a password hash, so you don't even have to know the passwords for logins, right? Um, Things like that. So highly recommend DBAtools for migrations. Log shipping. So just a quick review of how transaction log-based migrations typically go. So we're going to restore a full database backup with no recovery, right? Meaning that leaves the database in what we call standby mode. It's not accessible, but we're able to restore additional backups, transaction log backups. And then we take our transaction log backups from the existing source system and we restore them on a continuous basis uh, until we're ready to do this migration, right? Migration time, we take our outage on the original system, we take a final transaction log backup, and we restore it with recovery. This brings the database online on the new server, right? And you know we've been doing database migrations like this for many many years. Whether you're using actual log shipping or just restoring transaction logs that you have from your backups, doesn't matter. Um, and this is great. And this webinar is certainly not about why you shouldn't be doing this, because this is tried and true. We use it in many many migrations. But there's a couple of issues that you can run into with this, particularly when you're in an availability group environment. One, and this isn't even availability group based, you know, if you have a lot of databases, this can be kind of cumbersome, right? You know, if you only have 2 or 3 databases, something, you know, a small number of databases, setting up your backups and log restores is not that big of a deal. But if you have, you know, 50 databases on a server, that can end up being a lot of work, right? Um, but in an availability group environment, you're not going to be able to initialize, the replicas, the secondaries in that new availability group until you bring those databases online. So if you have large databases and you're using a log shipping based migration, you're going to have to restore those databases onto the secondaries and bring those into the availability group at go live time, right? Which may not be um, desirable. You know, if you're using readable secondaries, if that's a big part of what you're doing. So distributed availability groups were introduced in SQL Server 2016, and they've improved significantly since then. Uh, what a distributed availability group is essentially an availability group of availability groups. Is the best way I know to describe it. What you're going to have is, you know, 2 or more what I'm calling local AGs, but just, you know, standard availability groups. And this can be used for upgrades like we're going to talk about, but it's also often used for, geographically dispersed scale out, right? Multiple regions, multiple data centers. Because what it does is in a distributed availability group, there's a primary AG and a secondary AG. And the primary AG works the way we understand AGs to work. You have a primary replica, which is read write, And you have secondary replicas, which can either just be standby or they can be readable secondaries, right? The secondary availability group, what we think of as the primary, becomes something called the forwarder, right? And what happens is that the primary availability group replicates changes only one time to the forwarder, which then in turn replicates those changes to one or more secondaries, right? So this can be really useful in, again, scale out situations where, maybe we have these secondary availability groups in different regions, different data centers to get the data closer to users for reads, for example, or maybe it's a high availability type of thing. But we don't want to, send that replication traffic from the primary in data center one to all of the secondaries, all of the replicas in data center two, right? So that's one of the uses of distributed AGs. But what we're going to talk about today is the fact that that secondary availability group can be on a newer version of SQL Server than the primary, which makes this a great option for doing migrations, upgrades of availability groups in environments where we can't take a long outage. It's a 24/7 mission critical application. We can't say, hey, we're going to take a whole weekend to migrate, or even 4 hours to migrate in some cases. And so the way this works is um, the target, or what we call the secondary AG, can be a newer version of SQL Server. It can be a different version of Windows. Distributed AGs are a 100% SQL Server concept. So you notice here from the that last slide, the Windows clusters are completely independent, right? So in a distributed AG, there's no Active Directory objects or dependencies, DNS, things like that. There's also not a common listener, right? So you're going to have a listener for each of these AGs, but not for the distributed AG, right? So, but we can, be on a newer version of SQL Server. What are some of the limitations? And this is important to understand. And if you think about this, it's kind of the same thing when you are upgrading, or just call it restoring databases from older versions of SQL Server to newer versions of SQL Servers. There are some things that just aren't going to work, right? You're not going to be able to go backwards, right? Go from the new version back to the old version, right? You can't restore that database. So those are some of the things that are the same for this. Even if your secondary AG is in synchronous commit, while it's participating in this AG, it's going to show up as partially healthy. The databases will say synchronizing in recovery as opposed to synchronized, right? We're going to use asynchronous replication mode um, up until we do the final actual cutover. Okay. And so, that's just something that for some people is a little bit disconcerting, that it says it's not synchronized. And what we're going to see in the demo is that we actually look at the log sequence numbers that have been hardened in the source and the target to ensure that all of our data is up to date, is the way that we do this. You cannot have readable secondaries on your secondary AG, right? So your secondary AG is just going to be sitting there taking this, synchronization replication from the primary AG so that all the data is up to date, so that when you cut over, it's essentially just a failover, but it's not going to be usable in any way. Again, no failback, right? Because we have upgraded our database to new versions of SQL Server. You cannot fail back from the upgraded version to the old version. And similarly, once you fail over, you're not going to be replicating back to the source AG, right? So this is really an upgrade methodology, right? And it's a one-way trip when you do that failover. Now, if you have that distributed AG and you do this failover, You absolutely can then in turn upgrade your source AG and include it in the distributed AG if that's in your use case. But those are just kind of some of the things when you're using this for upgrade that you're going to need to be aware of.